Oh, okay, so I want to start by talking about compromise and the concept of compromise. Right? Like sometimes it's an incredibly negative term. It means you betrayed yourself. Everything you stood for, everything you hoped to be about, everything you promised to your spouse that you'd be about, or your kids, or your boss. I mean, sometimes compromise is just entirely ugly and gross, right? But sometimes it's beautiful, remarkable, amazing, particularly if you're a male, rare, right? Like, because it speaks to your ability to not get your own way, right? I thought that was funny. Last service thought it was funny too, but apparently you guys all think you're good males. Sometimes compromising involves recognizing there's other people on the planet, and that it can go their way too on occasion. So I had a compromise a couple months ago. I think it was of the good variety. You can decide, but it involves the screen right there. Backing up a couple months, Lenny and Joe and some others, they did the research over the course of the summer to figure out what screen we needed to buy, because we needed to buy a screen to move into here, and frankly we wanted to be able to share it with the Grand Street, so we need to be able to install it, which, by the way, they're using our stuff on their show right now, which is really fun confirmation of vision, and they left the projector on all night. But anyway, so we got this screen. It arrived the Monday before the first Sunday service here, so a lack of margin might be one way to say that. It got here on Monday. It arrived in a very long OSB box. I don't know, was it 15 feet long? How long was that box? 15 feet, 16 feet, something like that, 30 feet? I don't know, it just gets bigger every service. But it was encased in OSB about this big square. So Tuesday after work, Joe and myself and some others converged on this place with the ultimate plan to hang the screen and eliminate this variable from our lives. And so we, opened up the lid of the box. We had to pry it off because there were staples, and Joe stabbed my finger with one of the staples. We had to lift the lid off, and then it was like, if you ever opened a Mac computer, the experience is like, because everything's individually wrapped. And so we kind of very gently are unwrapping the screen, because all we knew is it cost a lot of money, but we didn't really know what we had. And we kind of gingerly carried the thing to the stage and laid it across up here. And then we're getting ready to hoist the screen in the air, and that was when Joe realized that the hardware was not there. So we panicked for a moment and kind of searched around and went, oh, geez, yeah, the hardware's not there. And then we looked at what it was supposed to look like and realized that, we weren't going to be able to retrofit something from Lowe's. So we tucked our tail between our legs and we stuck the screen back in the box. And on Wednesday morning, Lenny and Joe and myself drew straws to figure out who had to call, and I lost that one. So Wednesday morning, Lenny gives me the name of the place we bought it from. I called them. They said, we're not obligated to anything. Would you like the name of the manufacturer? Of course I would. And so I called the manufacturer, and after waiting on hold for a while, finally got through to this guy. And I just said, dude, the hardware didn't come with the screen. He said, you're not supposed to. What? You don't need any hardware. I said, well, how do you propose that we hang the screen from the ceiling? He said, it's all already there. I said, no, it's not. He said, yeah, it is. I said, no, it's not. He said, yeah, it is. I said, where is it then? He said, it's already attached to the pipe. And he begins to describe to me that if you take the screen out of the box, you'll see this big pipe, which, I wasn't born yesterday. I saw the pipe. And he said, somewhere in there's these hooks, and that's where you hang the screen from. And I said, dude, it's not there. He said, well, dude, you don't need hardware. Everything that you need is already attached to the pole. Okay, so I'm starting to panic and starting to wonder if, someone needs to get fired and maybe we didn't need hardware. And so I open up the PDF on my computer, and sure enough, step 4, you can see it. Step 4, with the screen line on the floor, install the 3 clamps on the reinforcement tape on the header as shown in illustration A. Illustration B is the clamps. Right? They are the clamp. I don't know how to say that with sounding like I have an education, but you know what I'm getting at. So I said, okay, dude, open the PDF. He opens the PDF. I said, dude, the instructions say install the clamps. Where are the clamps? He says over his shoulder, hey, so what do I tell him about the instructions and the pictures of the clamps on the instructions? I heard the guy say to him, they're wrong. So he says to me, they're wrong. I said, then why are they on the instructions? He said, I don't know, we got to get engineering to rewrite the instructions. Some engineer's getting paid $50 an hour to design this thing, and some guy is getting paid $10 an hour to field my questions, but he just proclaims that the engineers are wrong. So I said, okay, dude, this is really ridiculous, but the clamps that the instructions say I need and you say I don't, I need those. He said, no, you don't. So my compromise, I said, okay, if I walk over to the theater with my cell phone in hand and I take a picture of the screen in various places and demonstrate to you that there is no way to hang the screen without the clamps, would you overnight me the clamps? Because we got to have this thing up by Friday. He said, of course. So I come over here with this email written on my hand, took pictures of the screen after bringing it out and all this. This whole thing started at 8:30. It's now 10:30. So I send the pictures to him. I walk back over to my office. I call him back. And like some gal named Betty answers the phone, and I'm like, okay, dude, I need to talk to Eric. Well, why do you need to talk to him? Well, because like I've already dealt with him. And she said, well, there's no direct line. There's no extensions. I have no way of getting you his number. So what she determined would be the right outcome there would be just to send me back to like customer service purgatory. And I just, listen to the music. And then when the next available service representative came on, if it was Eric, then it was a win. And if it wasn't, they'd put me back into purgatory. I'm not lying. This is ridiculous. So I lasted about 10 minutes and I hung up and I'm like, this is what we pay Sarah for. And so I went on to Sarah's office and I was like, Sarah, you've got a speakerphone sitting there. I've got a cell phone. Would you get on hold and just wait for them to get through? So at 11:30-ish, she comes in my office, Adam, I've got him. Okay, I said. So the guy's like, Kate, Adam, dude, here's the deal. Your screen came in a box. Yeah, I said, I've confirmed the fact that it came in a box. In the middle of the box is where the screen actually sits. Yep, I said, I know that. He said, at the far end of that box, there's a compartment. Yep, I know. And he said, in that compartment, that's where your hardware is. I said, I understand that, dude. What I've been trying to tell you is that it's empty. The compartment is empty. He said, oh, you're kidding. Well, we better send you the stuff. I'm not making this up. Compromise. I compromised. I said, dude, I'll waste my time and walk over there. And everything in me needed to hear him say, you're right, you need the hardware. But, I didn't force the issue, being the godly man that I am. Just kidding. And they took good care of us after that. Oh, okay, so several weeks ago we started this series called The God Confusion. And our desire was to deal candidly with people's confusions about God. Both for those who follow Jesus and those who don't yet follow Jesus. We said, let's have the conversations that we're all having, and let's contribute to those conversations. Let's contribute to the stuff that is confusing us about Christ. Let's contribute information about what's confusing our friends and our family members from Christ. Let's just add, increase the water level of this conversation in our community. Well, last week, we dealt with atheism. No small feat, for sure. And what I would suggest to you is the bottom line of what we wrestled with last week. Is at the very least, we have to confess that saying there is no God is a statement of faith. And I would even go so far as to say a statement of extreme faith. Like it takes a lot of faith to come to that conclusion. When we say there is no God, we move beyond rationale, we move beyond reason, we move beyond science, we move beyond certainty, we move into the realm of faith for a bunch of reasons that we talked about last week. At the other end of the spectrum, I suppose, would be to say that Jesus is God, and in him is life and life at its best, is a statement of extreme faith. I don't mean weird, I don't mean nutty, I don't mean like dumb, I just mean like at times in your life, it's going to require extreme faith. Moments like this, it's a little easier. Sickness, disease, relational, breaking, it gets more difficult. Well, this week we're going to talk about agnosticism and really deal with this question, is I don't know enough to know. And, agnosticism presents itself as a compromise, as a midpoint between two extremes. One extreme that says there is no God, the other that says there is and I know him personally. That's where agnosticism steps into the conversation. It's diplomatic. It's a middle way. It's a compromise, and oftentimes considered of the positive variety, because what we're doing is we're bridging that gap, and we can have conversations with them, and we can have conversations with them, because we're non-committed in each direction. Agnosticism was a term, actually, this is going to feel a little bit like a college seminar, but I just want to deal with this for a little bit. Or maybe you'll say elementary based upon my intelligence. I don't know, I'll leave that to you. But agnosticism was a term coined by a guy named Thomas Henry Huxley. We have a picture. And with, are those pork chops? I don't know what those are. Those are like big chops or something. If you can grow those, you're smart. That's what I got to say. And I'm working on the beard thing, haven't never before passed the 1 week threshold because the porcupine thing drives me crazy, but I'm trying. But I'm weak in this department, so I could use some of his DNA. Thomas Henry Huxley was a scientist kind of the 20th century in Britain. If you Wikipedia him, which your teachers tell you isn't a valid form of information, but it really is. But don't tell them I said that. If you Wikipedia him, one of the first things you'll read about is that he's called Darwin's bulldog. Because while Darwin was, in the lab, so to speak, testing and sending out theories, Thomas Henry Huxley took it upon himself to kind of bring those to the public square, to force the conversation and to force the issue in his culture. He was engaging with debates. It with Christ followers and just theists in general. He was forcing this issue of evolution in his culture to the extent where he's even credited in the British schooling system with prioritizing its place in the curriculum. He coined the term, certainly it was a philosophical term prior to him, he coined it by taking two Greek terms and combining them. It was at a lecture, I think it was in 1960. He took the term a, which means without, which means that if you're from North Dakota, you're a pessimist, because you're always saying a, right? And you're always, a. We need to bring that back to our culture. So we need a few volunteers to just say a. Instead of word, just follow up sentences with going a. Awesome. And we'll all watch Fargo together someday. Anyway, he took the word a, which means without, and the word gnosis, which means knowledge, thus forming the term without knowledge, agnosticism. His point was just that. As a scientist, or at least someone that's brain bent that way, I keep saying that because he wasn't formally educated, though wise himself, he kept saying, like, there's this conversation about whether or not God exists. And the form of knowledge that I profess, I have no way of knowing. My five senses can't tell me whether or not there's an afterlife. My five senses can't tell me whether or not there is a God. And so on that subject, I am without knowledge. And what he's saying, therefore, is that his view of knowledge disqualifies him from the conversation. Honest, I would say, to a large degree. In today's culture, I would suggest to you that agnosticism really happens in three forms, though. There's three different types of agnosticism. Maybe you can relate via yourself or someone you're walking through life with. The first one that we'll just simply call closed agnosticism. To be sure, this is the position from which Thomas Henry Huxley, what do you have to do to get called by your middle name all the time? Anyway, it's annoying to me because I have to keep saying this whole name. He was of the closed variety because a closed agnostic, they can't know. It's impossible to know, they would say, based upon knowledge as we see it. Again, the scientific method, the five senses, the ability to test something and then retest it to confirm it it's true. Based upon all of those issues, we can't know whether or not there's a God. It's impossible. And so the closed agnostic gives up. They're done with the conversation. I think you could say it this way, that whereas the atheist is really rejecting the idea that there's a God, a closed agnostic is really rejecting faith. Because faith and knowledge, they can't marry. And if you were here 2 weeks ago when we talked about, is there such a thing as truth, we talked about the relationship between faith and knowledge. We talked about truth and can it be known and does it even exist. This is their struggle. This is their plight. This is where the closed agnostic is stuck. Because by definition, when you say, I'm searching for God, you as a finite person, someone fixed in time, fixed to a certain geography, fixed to certain experiences, fixed to a short span of life, you're searching for the infinite. You're physical. You're searching for the non-physical. You were created. You're searching for the uncreated, that which has not been created. And so frankly, for the closed agnostic, their form of knowledge, it just doesn't go there. Faith can't intermingle with their form of knowledge. Now, certainly we could have conversations about the accuracy of that. That's not the point. Closed agnosticism says a knowledge that can't be scientifically tested has no value, and therefore the conversation's over. Now, probably, if you've been there, or if you're there now, or if you know people who are there, people who fall here, I would suggest, are more likely, or more accurately than closed agnostics, they're ignostics. Heard that phrase? It was new to me as I studied through this stuff. Ignosticism. Whereas the A stands for without, and agnostic, the I stands for indifferent. Because the ignostic very quickly moves from I don't know to I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. I'm indifferent. Where the agnostic rejects faith, the ignostic sees faith as invaluable, or not valuable. Invaluable means exponentially valuable. I know that anyway. Right? Like the agnostic says faith has no value to me. Asking an agnostic, is there a God, is like asking them the colors of the feathers of a bird on a planet that doesn't exist. I don't care. It's like asking me, what will you do when the Broncos beat the Jets today? I say, it's a completely irrelevant question because it's not going to happen, so don't even make me waste my time thinking about how that's going to go down. Now, we talked about compromise and suggested to you that agnosticism is a compromise. When it comes to extreme faith, it's a middle way. I actually want to disagree with myself. Atheism is extreme in its faith in saying there is no God. Following Jesus in many forms of religion are extreme in their assertion that there is one and they know who he is. Where agnosticism involves some extreme faith, in my view, is its assertion that spirituality has no value. To come to the conclusion that spirituality is a waste of time, that it has no purpose, it has no point, it doesn't contribute any value to humanity, is quite a bold leap of faith. When you look out across, anthropology and you look at the human experience and you see that spirituality is so intertwined with what it means to be human that if you separate those, you almost take away humanity. I'm not trying to look down on anyone, but just kind of call it what it is and level the playing field. To an agnostic, their claim that faith lacks value is a quite bold claim. When we live our lives and saying spirituality means nothing, that's bold. There's a man who's much smarter than myself, Francis Collins, who addresses this very issue, and I want you to hear from him via video.
Why? You were not a believer early in your life. Why?
It was the way I was raised. I was raised in this remarkable environment by a drama professor, father, and a playwright mother. Surrounded by theater, music, the arts. They were doing the 60s thing, except it wasn't quite the 60s yet. And I was exposed to all kinds of fascinating ways to learn about life and the world and ideas. But faith was not really on the list of things that were talked about. It wasn't that faith was put down or considered inappropriate for other people. It just didn't sort of enter the conversation in my childhood.
Did it exist in your mind as a question?
Oh, I had glimmers of something, some longing outside of myself, some sense that maybe there was a God up there that I might be able to reach out to.
What brought you as an adult then to faith?
Well, first, as an adult, I walked very far away from faith. I went from being sort of vaguely interested, but not really, to becoming an atheist. As a scientist studying physical chemistry, quantum mechanics, I became convinced that everything about the universe could be described by equations.
So what changed that for you?
Well, I changed my life plan from physical science to medicine. And when I went to medical school, the ideas about death and dying, which had been rather hypothetical, became very real. You can't be in that environment, sitting at the bedside of people who are facing the end of their lives without having it affect you.
Did you set out to find God or to find that there was no God?
I set out to prove that my atheist position was correct. I set out to try to find out what really were the rigorous arguments that I assumed were there that would rule out any possibility of God for a thinking person.
You must have found many of them.
I found some. Many of them were ones I had cooked up in my own mind. But the harder I looked at them, the flimsier they were. All of us human beings have a sense that there is such a thing as right and there's such a thing as wrong. What a curious thing. Where does that come from? If you were looking for evidence of a God who cares about human beings, not just a God who started the universe in motion and then wandered off somewhere else, wouldn't this be an interesting place to find him? Basically as something written within our hearts, universally in humankind, making us different from other species, and calling us to be good and holy, pointing us as a signpost, if you will, towards something outside ourselves that is much more good and much more holy than we can imagine.
Did you have at some point a born-again experience?
When people talked to me about born again, I didn't know what they were really referring to when I was growing up. But yes, I did have a moment where I became a believer. I had struggled for 2 years with this debate within myself, gradually coming to the conclusion that belief in God was the most plausible of the choices, but that it couldn't be proved. And after many months of struggling with whether to make that leap, on a beautiful fall day, hiking in the Northwest with my mind a little more clear than usual because there were not the usual distractions, I felt I could no longer resist. And I became a believer that day in the sunshine, in the shadow of the Cascade Mountains.
That guy led the project that mapped the human genome. kind of a smart dude. He's actually written several books that if you're interested in that whole conversation between science and faith, he has several books that I'm told are remarkable. I'm not intelligent enough to read them, but I've heard they're good. Okay, so chances are if you don't relate to agnosticism or ignosticism, there's really a third category that I think captures most of people who would identify themselves as agnostic, and it's this open agnostic idea. Open agnosticism, whereas agnosticism or closed agnosticism says, there's no God and is closed to that. Open agnosticism is just the opposite. They're open to the idea of God existing. And open agnosticism, to be sure, happens on a continuum. On one end of that would be someone who is open to the idea, but is pretty casual, non-active in actually searching that out, wrestling that through, thinking that through in ways that Francis Collins, they're kind of models. They're not doing that. They're not asking the hard questions. They're not thinking about this stuff. At the other end of the continuum is someone who's open to the idea of there being a God and open to the place of faith and is actually pursuing that, wrestling with that. You might liken open agnosticism to a 5th century explorer who, as a child, was raised in a culture in which he was told that the oceans can't be crossed and that the earth is flat. And the day where he began to wonder if that was actually true, he in fact became an open agnostic. And you can imagine how his wondering actually developed into, well, maybe it actually is possible that the earth is round, that the oceans can be crossed. And the idea of a possibility, you can imagine how at some point in that explorer's life became a faith. He began to actually believe that the oceans could be crossed, that the earth was round. And that belief eventually became a quest, something that he wanted to go find out. And he began to secure the education and the resources and the backing from others to go figure that out. And eventually the quest became an active adventure where he's no longer just sitting and wondering, he's no longer just believing, he's actually out there wrestling it out. He's on the ocean, searching to see if the oceans can be crossed. Brian McLaren, in a book that I'm really indebted to for this whole study, he imagines a dialogue that, it's a hypothetical dialogue between Brian and somebody else that would go like this. So you're an agnostic, but you're open to the possibility of God existing? Yes, exactly. Brian says, if God exists, would it make sense to you to pray? To which Joe says, pray? I'm not even sure where I'd begin. Well, if God is intelligent enough to create the universe and personal enough to create conscious life, it might make sense to say, God, are you out there? To which his friend Joe says, kind of like ringing a doorbell to see if anybody is home or sending a test email to see if anybody responds. Exactly. And to take it a step further, I could also imagine saying, if you're there, please help me to know you. Yeah, I wouldn't have any problem with that. It makes sense. I might feel kind of silly, like I'm talking to myself, but there wouldn't be any harm in it, I suppose, as long as we wouldn't have to take it any further than that. My guess is that you would only want to take it any further than that if you wanted to. And you'd only take it, and you'd only want to if your prayers were in some way answered. To which Joe says, it sounds like an experiment. Yes, faith itself is a kind of experimental process, and open agnostics are well placed to begin experimenting. But doesn't it then require faith to gain more faith? That's a great question. Do you have enough faith to pursue more faith? It sounds like I do. Perhaps some of you are at that place where you're ready to move from what we might call open agnosticism to experimental faith. There's a verse in Hebrews, one of my favorite verses in the entire Bible, Hebrews 11:6, it says, anyone who comes to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Anyone who comes to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards anyone who earnestly seeks him. One of my favorite promises in the entire text. And yet one, that I experienced for the first time at 19 years old, but I didn't even know it was a promise. And I hate to use myself as the example here, but we tried to do some interviews this week and it just didn't work out. But when I was 19, I was working for Coca-Cola. I'd graduated the year before. I was dating a gal who was still a junior in high school. Sorry, dads, I was that guy. I was the villain. Anyway, and it's really all I had going on was that relationship with her and really all that I cared about. And yet, as any of us could appreciate having been in high school before, I could see the handwriting on the wall in the early parts of that fall as she was a junior and I was out of high school. And all that kind of culminated one day in January when she expressed to me on a Friday night her desire to go to the varsity boys basketball game. And I had already made a decision that I would not be that guy, like the dude who hung out at the high school the year after he graduated and like bought all the high school kids cigarettes in the parking lot and stuff like that, sat in the student section during basketball. I refused to be that guy. So I took a pass, though my bottom lip was hanging a long ways out because I was a little pouty about it. In fact, I still remember I sat in my room. My dad had an attic in his house, and my room was up in the attic. And I had a Sega Saturn, which is hard to believe, but that was like the pinnacle of gaming technology at the time. The Sony Sega thing was just starting to happen, and I thought the Sega was going to win out, and I was wrong. I was playing John Elway quarterback football, which wasn't a very good game. I didn't even really like it, and I had a cup of pink Zinfandel box wine. Things are bleak when you're drinking pink Zinfandel wine out of a cup, So I'm sitting in my room in my little camping chair playing this game I didn't even really like. I don't remember what time she stopped by the house after the game was over. I don't remember the conversation. I just remember, what I remember is standing next to her Ford Escort as she pulled out of the driveway, and knowing in my heart that it was over, it was done. That was that. The inevitable that I'd been prolonging had finally happened. I remember falling down pathetically in my yard and punching the grass a couple times. Funny how real life is, when that stuff happens, and yet now you look at it. Anyway, I made my way back upstairs into my room. I was home alone, distraught, broken, hopeless, and so I picked up the phone and I called my mom, who lived in Missoula, and particularly I wanted to talk to my stepdad, who was a guy who's experienced a lot of life, and I knew that, and he and I had grown close over particularly my senior year. He was a guy who, he had two twin brothers that were like 11 months older than him, and so they were literally the grade ahead of him in school, and so when they were seniors, he was a junior. The two twins were riding dirt bikes outside of Laurel, and one of them lost control and went broadside, and just as he lost control, the other one came up and T-bowed him, killed him, broke his neck. Seniors in high school. I don't know when, somewhere in John's 20s, he was boating, he was water skiing, and I don't know the details, but the rope had been thrown in the water, and he was still in the water, and unbeknownst to him and the driver, it had worked its way behind his knees and up to the prop, and so when the driver hit the throttle, it grabbed the rope and, of course, twisted it up the prop, which shortened the rope very quickly and sucked him right into the prop of the motor. He lost his leg below the knee. So this is a guy, I knew this guy's experienced some of the worst of life. So I'm talking to John on the phone, and he wasn't a particularly spiritual guy or, hugely spiritual guy, and he just said, Adam, when life hurts that bad, all you can do is just give the pain to God. Just, in hindsight, it's 32 now, going like, that was a wise statement. And luckily I had a context, because the family that I was hanging out with a lot, that girl's family, drugged me to church once a week, and it was a great church, and I'd hung out there for a couple of years. I didn't make any decisions there, but I knew enough about God, the God of the Bible, that there was this open invitation, to give him your life. And sorry if the mixed metaphor bugs you, but what I would say I did that night was I just kind of went like, okay, God, I'm all in. I'm all in, God, because I don't know what else I'm going to do. It was later that I learned Hebrews 11:6, that anyone who comes to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. There's a lot about spiritual development that I don't get. In fact, I feel like one of the biggest areas where I let us down is in my understanding of the systems of spiritual growth and spiritual development. I understand what you do for a person because the whole thing is so messy to me. Some people tell them to read their Bible and they're golden, and some people tell them to read their Bible and they're jerks. It's just a messy thing. There's so much about spiritual development that confounds me. But one thing I understand is when someone earnestly seeks God, there's a couple things that go on. First of all, we have a hard way of telling whether or not someone's earnestly seeking God. And we get ourselves in a lot of trouble by making judgment calls on whether or not they are. But bigger than that, and I know that there's many stories in this room that tell this exact same story. When someone earnestly seeks God, they might pray a prayer, they might sign their name on a card, they might stand up and sing. There's a billion different things that they could do to express that. But when someone makes a decision in their heart to earnestly seek God, stuff changes dramatically. And God is faithful to make old things new there. The Apostle Paul, one of the most brilliant men to ever live, he wrote this book called Romans, And it's this book where in particular he's wrestling with, is salvation for the Jews too? Like, is it for the Gentiles too? What he would call the goyim, the Gentiles. Is it just for the Jews? Is the Jewish Messiah just for them? Or does it extend to everybody else? And for 11 chapters, he argues in ways that law schools still use the material today for God's grace. That God's grace extends to everybody. And so having developed this really strong argument of God's grace, in chapter 12 he starts this way. He says, therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, so in light of God's grace, in light of the cross, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Now, what Paul and his audiences would have had in mind when he said offer your bodies as living sacrifices was something we can't appreciate. Maybe it's hunting season, so we can a little bit better. But right, we're talking about animal sacrifice here. Something that wasn't limited to the Jews, something that it permeated all of Roman culture at the time. And in Jewish culture in particular, he's thinking, in my view, of the burnt offering, which is the offering that's given every morning and every evening, which, unlike most other offerings, nothing is reserved for the worshiper. It's this strong statement of, I'm going to do the most unorthodox, counterintuitive thing. I'm going to take my most valuable animal and I'm going to burn it as worship to God. And what Paul says is, in view of God's grace, don't take your best calf. You crawl up on the altar. You offer your life to God. In view of God's mercy, not to earn his mercy, in light of his mercy, you crawl up there. And then he goes on to say this, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world. I always thought this was a command. I don't think it is anymore. I think it's an implication of what came before it. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is. His good, pleasing, and perfect will. It's Hebrews 11:6. Paul is saying, you crawl up on that altar. You go all in, and God will transform you. Old things will be made new. Suddenly, you'll understand the will of God because God will change your heart. Now, for those of you that are wrestling this stuff through and you're truly walking with us through this God confusion journey because you're truly confused and truly journeying, there's a place for intellectual argument about the validity of Christ. But there's more to it than that. And there's also this place of just going, at some point, I just got to go all in. And in that process, decide whether or not God is real. For others of you, those of you that follow Jesus, like, you could tell the very same story I just told, but better. And my hope for you this week is two things. First, that you'd find time this afternoon, sometime in the week, that you'd literally sit down when you get home from church and schedule a half an hour where the only thing you're going to do is reflect upon that moment for you. In gratitude, worship God for where you would be and where you are in light of going all in. Just taking the time to go like, wow, I'd be living there, I'd have that degree, I'd be married to him. Oh, geez, like, just take the time to recognize how God shifted the trajectory of your life. And second, my challenge to you is we talk about at Narrate all the time about telling God's story by the way we serve. And I hope that always stays primary. But one of the things that I think has to confront us in this is are you telling your story of transformation? I don't mean with a blowhorn. I don't mean on the corner at Walmart. I don't mean obnoxiously. I don't mean in unsolicited ways. But I mean as you're journeying through life with people who are having conversations of faith, are you still considering valid your own personal transformation story? Because while intelligent conversation about science is important, so is your story of transformation. Are you being faithful to tell that story? God, we so want to be a movement that sees people come to know you for the very first time. And we recognize that you also call us to be respectful in that process. And so we're trusting you and leading us through that tension. Help us to know when to tell the story and when to keep our mouths shut. And for our friends who are truly having this conversation and truly confused, I pray that they would hear your voice simply affirming them, that they wouldn't hear any false voices of urgency. We love you, Jesus.